January 13th meeting of the Eugene Urban Renewal Agency. So, City Manager?
Thank you, Mayor. And in the interest of time, I'll just turn it over to Denny.
So, thank you. Good afternoon. Since we adopted the Riverfront Master Plan, EWEB Riverfront Master Plan, we've talked a lot about the significance and the importance of this project. And given the time, I'm going to skip that part of the story and jump ahead to really one aspect of that project, which is an agreement with EWEB that we've been working on that would really put the Urban Renewal Agency in a leading role as EWEB's agent for the sale and disposition of the EWEB property. We've talked a little bit about at a high level about the deal points in a recent executive session. The complete deal points are actually an attachment in your packet in attachment A. Those deal points were reviewed and there was a resolution approved to direct the EWEB general manager to move forward with this agreement based on those deal points. So what I'd like to do is quickly walk through the deal points and then answer a couple of questions relative to the agreement. First of all, again, the Urban Renewal Agency would take the lead, acting as EWEB's agent, in the negotiation, sale, and redevelopment of the EWEB Riverfront property. In that scenario, the Urban Renewal Agency would really have sole discretion as far as who we negotiate with, so long as those development proposals are consistent with the master plan. Another aspect is that the Urban Renewal Agency would guarantee that EWEB receive a minimum purchase price for the property. That guaranteed purchase price is a range of $6.5 to $6.9 million. And the reason there is a range is there is some parking parcels that EWEB would like to retain now to support their administration building and the tenants they have there, but they could be surplus in the future depending on if replacement parking is found or not found. So some of that may be added or subtracted given what happens with parking. So that's why there's a little bit of a range. The guaranteed price would be delivered within 5 years. And really the price was a midpoint between a couple of appraisals that the U of O Foundation and EWEB completed on the property. So if you take the midpoint of those two appraisals and subtract out basically 5 years worth of staff time for us to work on this project, that's really how we derived the price, the guaranteed price with EWEB. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. What that guaranteed price means is that regardless of how we decide to sell the property or how much we sell the property for, EWEB would receive that guaranteed amount. If we sell it for less, they'd still receive the guaranteed amount. If we sell it for more, there's a formula, and I'll walk through that formula in just 1 second. If all of the property doesn't sell within the 5-year period, we are obligated to issue the guaranteed amount to EWEB, but we're not obligated to own the property. I think that's an important distinction. We still have the authority to continue to market and negotiate the property after the 5-year period, which gives us an opportunity to still recover some or all of that guaranteed price payment after the 5-year period. The Urban Renewal Agency could also choose to purchase before or after that before or after that 5-year period, but that's not something that we're considering at this point. Also, again, as I've discussed, if any property is removed or added, that guarantee price would be adjusted. And one scenario that might require that would be if, for example, some of the property is found to be highly contaminated, and we don't anticipate that because the reports have been very positive at this point. It could be, X square foot could be removed from the property that would be sold, and the guaranteed price would be reduced based on that square footage that's removed from the property. We don't anticipate that, but we have at least accounted for that possibility. If property sells, I mentioned if the property sells for more than the guaranteed amount, there's a formula. Basically, the first $1 million over the guaranteed price, 75% of the excess proceeds or excess over the guarantee would go to EWEB, 25% to the agency. The second $1 million over the guaranteed price would be 50-50 split, and then any additional over the second $1 million would be 25% of the proceeds would go to EWEB, 75% to the agency. EWEB will agree to complete the environmental remediation necessary to obtain a no further action letter from DEQ on the property. They will establish a remediation fund, the amount of $1 million to cover the cost of that NFA process and any unexpected remediation of the property, environmental remediation. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the city and the urban renewal agency are not accepting any responsibility for environmental issues on the property. Because EWEB will continue to occupy the building, they do have a need to retain some of the parking. We have an agreement or a provision in the agreement that would suggest that if we can find replacement parking, that some of that parking could maybe be redeveloped and put into the surplus property. There's some other remaining deal points, and most of those really just involve EWEB being able to occupy and operate their facilities without interruption. So I'm going to jump to a couple of questions. The first one is why is this proposed agreement favorable for both EWEB and the Urban Renewal Agency? First of all, both of them are Eugene public agencies. Both of us have a vested interest in seeing the community's master plan vision for the riverfront move forward, while also assuring that the best use of public resources in each of our public service missions are met. So, of course, EWEB is actively engaged in providing public utilities. This guaranteed price allows them to get on with that business, to move forward with certainty on the property. And in a sense, the sale proceeds are retained in the community because they benefit another related city public entity, and ultimately they could even benefit this agreement could benefit the ratepayers by providing some certainty of price. On the other hand, the Urban Renewal Agency is actively engaged in transformation of the riverfront urban renewal district area. That's the core mission, one of the core missions of the agency. And this is the work that we do. We have redevelopment experience. If you look at AgriPac and the courthouse and the Northwest Community Credit Union project, major redevelopment of brownfield projects. This is the work that we do. And we also have the tools, so I think there's some benefit in meshing together the tools and the negotiations together as we move forward. The agreement also offers some distinct advantage to the Urban Renewal Agency and the community. It's a two-party agreement that makes it more efficient. You have a triangular three-party agreement, it gets a little bit more complicated. So I think this two-party format sets us up for success more easily, and ultimately redevelopment is more feasible potentially. We spent years of planning for downtown, for the riverfront. We've heard from the community that this is a very important project. With this agreement, I think the benefit really to the community and the agency is that we have more direct involvement. There's a potential that we can directly impact the outcome on this project. For example, who purchases the property, who redevelops the property, what are the proposed uses, how does the project meet the master plan goals, what is the quality of the project, how does the development add value to the park, and how does the park add value to the development. How the redevelopment site moves forward in a timely manner. We have better control of those variables that I think are very, very important. So therefore, I think this agreement is a strong approach. The second question really is, how is this guaranteed price a good investment for the community? I think that's a reasonable thing to ask. First of all, we have an opportunity to recover some of the guaranteed price in the sales negotiations. Even if we don't end up selling for the full guarantee amount, which has occurred in other urban renewal projects that we've worked on, there's still an opportunity for a high value outcome, I think, in this equation. This is a 100-year investment. This is the way that we're looking at it. Whatever happens there could be on our riverfront and characterize our riverfront for 100 years. We've taken investment risks in the past. The Lane Community College Downtown Center, the Tate Condominiums, Broadway Commerce Center, the Federal Courthouse, Broadway Place. Those are all investments with some risk going into those that we've taken in the past. So this is another opportunity that I think that does maybe require a little bit of risk. We've previously talked and presented a cost-benefit analysis regarding if the master plan is fully built out, what is the potential cost to the agency, what are those benefits? We've talked about those. We've presented a triple bottom line analysis to council regarding what are the TBL benefits for a project as it comes forward. And some of those benefits include property tax revenue, jobs, cleaning up a brownfield. We're meeting Envision Eugene goals. We're meeting regional prosperity goals, creating a 20-minute neighborhood. We're generating a public park that provides river access, spin-off development around the area. All of those things are potential benefits in addition to 2021 and really putting our best foot forward for then and into the future after 2021. The other part of the agreement, just quickly, is that through their RFQ process, the EWEB is originally selected the foundation, but has provided direction to move forward with Williams and Dame, which was another proposer in their RFQ process. They were vetted pretty closely in that RFQ review process. I was part of the panel. Nan Lawrence and Fifield were part of that panel that reviewed those. They scored very well. EWEB reached out to all of the proposers when the foundation pulled out, and Williams and Dame has expressed continued interest. We have met with them, a group of us, including the city manager, assistant city manager, Glenn Klein was involved, Kirk Corey. We made a trip up there, and we reviewed their projects. We looked at their projects. We believe they provide a really excellent opportunity. They're a strong developer. They have a lot of related experience, especially in downtown, especially on riverfronts, especially riverfront parks. And they're high quality. They're not afraid of public engagement, and I think they just bring a lot of really positive aspects to this project. So we support EWEB's direction here to move forward with Williams and Dame. So the action that we're asking today is that the Urban Renewal Agency authorize the agency's director to execute an agreement with EWEB related to negotiations, disposition, and redevelopment of the EWEB property consistent with the outline of terms that are in Exhibit A. Again, that Exhibit A, those terms mirror the terms that were reviewed by the EWEB board last week. And again, we feel like this agreement puts us really in the best position to deliver on the community's vision for a accessible, vibrant, world-class riverfront. So thank you.
Thank you. So my intention right now is to check around and see if you have questions. Not comments, but questions. Once we've answered questions, then we'll put it on the table and then comments and then vote. Okay? So we'll start with questions. Councilor Surratt and then Councilor Lincoln.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And I only have one question because I think much of the recommendation is clear. But you mentioned that if we haven't sold all the property for development, the non-public part, after that 5-year period, we would not be the owners, or we'd not be required to be the owners. Can you explain that further, and who would technically be the owners at that point?
EWEB would still own the property, so basically the agreement sets a path where we would be their agent for 5 years. At the end of that 5 years, if let's just say in the worst case scenario, none of the property is sold, we would still be obligated to issue that guaranteed price, but the agreement does not sunset. We still have an ability to negotiate the sale of the property after the 5-year period, so we would still act as the agent. We would have just delivered a guaranteed price and move forward, still marketing and working and trying to recover that guarantee, so to speak, after the 5 years.
And EWEB would continue to be the owner in that scenario?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I have Alan and then George Brown and then Mike Clark.
So following up on that, so we would, after 5 years, we would pay them, but we'd pay them $6-point-something million, but we wouldn't have ownership to it, but we'd get to retain the right to sell it.
That's correct.
Why wouldn't we take ownership of it?
It's an option. It's just not something that we're considering today.
I'm trying to think of a scenario why we would, where we would want to pay a bunch of money and not get ownership.
So the reason we're leaving it flexible at this point is because if we take ownership, then we do assume the environmental liabilities that may still be out there. If we don't take ownership, those liabilities remain with EWEB, and at any point before or after the 5 years, the agency can say, we've decided we do want to take ownership. And so at that point, whether it's 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 8 years from now, say, it now makes sense for whatever reason for the Urban Renewal Agency to take ownership of the remaining property that hasn't yet been sold. And just to clarify one point, let's assume we're able to sell half the property and we sell it for $3 million. 5 years from now, we wouldn't actually write a check for 6 point whatever. It would be 6 point whatever minus the $3 million that's already been sold. So it's a guaranteed total. We're picking up the difference between what has been sold and for what it was against that guaranteed price.
And how long is the term of this agreement?
This doesn't say, we haven't had that conversation with eWeb. In my mind, it's indefinite until the Urban Renewal Agency says we're ready to terminate it, because once it's terminated, then we would no longer be the agent for eWeb. They would then have the rights to sell and do whatever they want with it. The way we have talked about it is we don't know that all the property is going to get sold or developed within 5 years, so we would continue to be the agent after that. But at some point, if this body says, it's time for us just to own it and be done with the agreement, at that point you could make that decision, and we would tell eWeb, okay, it's time to sign a deed that transfers the remaining portions to the Urban Renewal Agency.
So I wouldn't want to see a deal that said at the end of 10 years we paid them $6.5 million and then we walked away from the deal and then they retained ownership.
I agree with you, and what I'm envisioning is an agreement that says at the end of 5 years we have made whatever that difference is to the guaranteed payment, and then we continue to be their agent until such time as the Urban Renewal Agency says it's time to end the agreement. So that the termination of the agreement would be this body's decision at some point in the future. The agreement would not say in 10 years it's done and we no longer have the rights to.
It's up to the council.
Yes.
And we can either walk away or buy it.
Yeah, although at that point you're not buying it because we've already paid the guaranteed price.
Right.
You're just saying transfer the deed to us.
Transfer. So that price never goes up.
Correct.
Okay. And what's the amount that's in the Riverfront Urban Renewal District cash right now?
We have approximately $9 million in cash, and then there's a $28.2 million remaining under the maximum indebtedness spending limit.
Okay. And we're supposed to spend about $3 million on the park. Minus $9 million leaves about.
It could be 3, it could be 4, it could be 5. It's because it hasn't been designed yet. But it's not a foregone conclusion that urban renewal would be used for some or all of that. It could be, but that's not been decided at this point.
Okay. And then let's go back to the environmental remediation and liability, Section 5. So it says eWeb agrees to complete the remediation necessary to get to NFA, no further action by DEQ, and they'll establish a $1 million remediation fund. And so in the instance where later on, they're obligated to do that within a certain period of time?
Correct. The they're working on getting that new further action letter now. The expectation is that NFA is achieved sometime during calendar year 2016.
And if later on an environmental issue is discovered, say they do excavation and find another one that wasn't found in the meanwhile, whose liability is that who pays for it?
It will be eWeb's liability
Take ownership.
unless we take ownership. It could be that a developer says, I'll buy the property, and for whatever reason, they'll agree to take on the responsibility. The $1 million fund, of that $1 million, eWeb could use up to $250,000 for the no further action letter remediation work. But that would leave then at a minimum $750,000 to deal with any of that unknown contamination that you're talking about. And so if a developer says, yeah, I'm really interested in this section over here, does a bunch of more due diligence, discovers, oh, there is something here, it's going to cost $100,000 to remediate it, I'm not willing to buy it unless it's remediated. Well, there's $750,000 sitting there to pay for that. In the event, that same hypothetical, and instead of it costing $100,000 to remediate, let's say it costs $10 million, or pick some astronomical number, the developer's going to say it's not worth it to us to take on that liability. EWEB's going to say it doesn't make sense financially to try to remediate all that, and this is assuming it doesn't pose a public health hazard. It's not leaching into the river, for example. And so for that particular parcel, what the agreement contemplates is that EWEB would continue to retain that parcel forever, and the guaranteed amount would be reduced by the square footage of that site.
Okay. And then the price, there is a lot of issues in here about parking, there's one section at the last sentence of Section 3, except for the mill lot and credit union parking area, which may be subject to a different rate determination. How does that work? And why is it written like that? Why isn't it just $10 a square foot?
Because when the appraisals were done, those particular parcels, which are the ones that are far more shovel-ready than the rest of the sites, actually have a higher value in the appraisals. And so what this contemplates is if EWEB ultimately retains those, we don't find alternate parking that works for them and better for us. If they ultimately retain those, then the guaranteed price gets reduced by whatever the appraisals say those two parcels are worth. So rather than being reduced by $10 a square foot, I don't know the number, but I think it's somewhere between $25 and $35 a square foot.
Based on appraised value.
Right.
Yes.
They're a bit more valuable.
Correct. That's correct.
And then we can also find alternative parking space somewhere nearby that would work for them, but they have to agree to that.
Yes.
EWEB does, okay. And then Section 8, the city staff will work with EWEB on possible changes to the master plan code regarding south side of the headquarters building. What does that mean? What's that in there for?
There's some infrastructure on the south side of the building, so backup generators, those types of things, and I think there's some overlap. My understanding of the issue, there's some overlap on properties that are contemplated for development in the master plan versus some slivers of property that they may need to retain for backup generators and so forth. So I think they want some flexibility to make sure basically that they have access to those kind of critical infrastructure. We're not talking about huge amounts of property. I think it's really slivers on the south side. And, we've talked about, can those be relocated? I mean, there's might be all kinds of options, but those all have costs associated with them and would need to be worked out. But that's really basically, they need access to maintain their operations, and there's some conflicts in the master plan.
And nothing in this would require the city council to actually approve any changes to the master plan. This just says that staff from the city will work with staff from EWEB to see how to address those, and then if that would actually require a master plan change, then that would be brought to you in your capacity as city council, and you could decide whether to approve it or not. This wouldn't bind you to do that.
George?
Thanks, Mayor. I've got some questions about the material here on the pages. Alan asked one of my questions about the south of the admin building. On the second page, talking about the environmental contamination, EWEB may pursue recovery costs from third parties and prior owners. The prior owner would be Chiquita. Is that correct? Who was the prior owner of the property?
I think it would go back 50, 80 years. It would not be Chiquita. It would be some entity, I think an oil company or gas company owned.
An oil company?
Right. I mean, if you go back 100 years.
For gasoline, yeah.
Right.
Okay. And then the next section, Section 7, it says EWEB needs parking for, customers, visitors, employees, and tenants. There are tenants in the headquarters building?
Yeah, the larger one is Electrical Geodesics, which is a technology company that has 50, 60, 70 employees. It's big.
Okay, and then does that include, I'm looking at this map, and at the corner here, it looks like Pearl and 4th there used to be Midgley's Glass there, I believe. There's a commercial building, is that?
Yes.
They would have to have parking also?
That would be part of their lease agreement, and so they probably have some reserve space within the eWeb parking, and that really, because eWeb is still the property owner, those negotiations about how those tenants park are really part of probably an existing lease, so I don't know that we would get directly involved in their tenants parking at this point.
Okay. Well, and then, this map is really inadequate to help us with. So the proposed area that we're going to give them a guaranteed price for, less any, emendations that may occur between now and 5 years, is 17.25 acres. And there's kind of a shaded line here that shows where it is, but so the 17.25 acres is only within this shaded line and does not include the 65-foot wide strip along the riverbank.
I brought a better image, and maybe I can pass this around and it'll shed some light. But generally, yes, it is the amount of property that eWeb is surplusing is approximately 17 acres. That is the property that we're talking about.
And George, the part that you're talking about, the 65 feet, that's the part that, do we already own that? Has the deed transferred, or is it going to transfer in the future? So that's part of a different agreement that's not covered by this, but that's going to be the part that we got or we're getting where we're paying $1 for it.
I see. And that's not included in the 17.25 acres.
Correct.
So if you look at the image just really quickly, the kind of large pink area is the surplus area. You can see the property around the eWeb admin building that has some parking just west of their building. But the kind of hash-slashed area that's kind of white slashed right next to the viaduct and across 4th Street, those are the two areas that we're really talking about as being potential surplus that eWeb will use for parking initially, but could potentially be surplused in the future.
Okay, so it's everything, this lighter area here, less the admin building, less this parking lot here, probably less the eWeb Credit Union building and lot, but it would include and it's labeled here, that was correct, it was Midgley's at one time. So the city would, in essence, be buying this property.
Well, we're not buying it, but we're the agent for eWeb to dispose of all of that surplus property.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can call it anything we want, but if we guarantee them a certain amount of money within 5 years, to me, we're buying it. I don't know of anyone that's given somebody money for property that did not regard it as buying the property. I mean, we can call it anything we want to, but in my view, we're essentially buying the property. Okay, I'm going to need another round. We have some more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. It's interesting. The building structures on the north on the riverbank there seem to be within the pink shaded area. We're not agents for that particular area, are we?
What structures are you referring to?
The headquarter building.
No, you can see there's kind of a boundary line in the colors kind of bleed together, but there is a boundary line that takes in the admin building.
Well, the fella can be hopeful, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, how long, I'm not sure I got a complete answer on this before. How long will it take us to get the quiet zone and to get the light moved? Rough time frame, just rough.
I think in the past it's been measured in years, not months, so it may be a couple, 2 to 3 years to have it fully implemented, depending how fast progress we can make with the railroads and federal authority and so forth.
It is saying about 3 years.
So, in reality, there's really no development that will take place until year 3, probably.
There's some shovel-ready property that's around 5th Street Market, around 4th Street, that could potentially move forward more quickly. That was the foundation's approach. If you recall, they said we're going to start around 5th because there's roads there, there's infrastructure there. It could be built on. It doesn't need access across 8th Street because it's over here. So that I wouldn't say that nothing could happen, but development around the steam plant, for example, might require that kind of access across 8th Street. So,
But it is our intention to seek agreements in those first 3 years that would be binding after the capacity to work, right?
yeah, and then I mentioned Williams and Dame. We have a draft of a 6-month negotiating period. So what we hope to do is negotiate over the next 6 months and bring forward potentially a next step, which is a development agreement that would have terms and so forth, and council would have an opportunity to review that, of course. But so within this year, our hopes is to have an actual development agreement that would put us on a path to start working seriously on a project.
Excellent news. Post year 5, is there any condition legally? Is there any potential scenario in which year 5 plus, and we've written a check, EWEB has any right, any legal capacity to say no when the Urban Development Agency says, we'd like to take ownership now?
The agreement hasn't been drafted, so if we do a poor job drafting the very detailed agreement, then the answer to that would be yes. But I can assure you that that will be one of the things we're very clear about in the agreement as to what happens during the first 5 years, but also what happens after that. And so it will be explicit that here's what can happen after 5 years, and we will likely include some examples. For example, the agency decides in year 22 to transfer title or have EWEB transfer title to the agency or transfer title to the city.
That's what I wanted to hear. You tell me that explicitly there was no risk there, because you're going to draft that thing so darn well. That's what I wanted to hear. Another question, can we put something into the agreement if the following hypothetical were to happen? Year 5 plus, year 6, some environmental catastrophe of some nature had previously occurred that we have no knowledge of today, which changes the overall value of the site on the portions that are undeveloped, changes the appraisal if another were to be had at that time, and we have already paid EWEB. Do we have a piece of the agreement that retroactively relieves us or rebates us that money for that undiscovered or previous defect?
That hasn't been discussed with EWEB. There will be some discussions as the detailed agreement gets negotiated that would deal at least with part of what you're talking about. For example, in year 6, due diligence after we've paid the guaranteed amount, due diligence is had in this section of the site, and something like that is discovered, and then the decision is made. There's not enough left in the remediation fund to actually cover all that, and so what we decide to do is we want EWEB to permanently retain that. Well, if that had happened prior to year 5, it would have been a deduct from the guaranteed amount.
Right.
Certainly we will be raising that as we're working on the formal agreement. What happens, and in my mind what would happen is, yes, there would be a rebate, as you're calling it, for that amount. But that wasn't discussed with EWEB. We didn't get into that level of detail in trying to work out this term sheet.
Okay.
But we are thinking about those issues.
So are we being asked today to approve it without that piece or with it, or exactly what?
What you're being asked to approve is the term sheet. If that was a critical piece where you said we would only agree to approve this in the event that we know if we discover that kind of issue, and so it's going to be a piece of property that EWEB is going to continue to retain permanently, that we would get a rebate $10 a square foot for that amount, that's something you could add. Now, that's different than what the EWEB board approved, so EWEB would have to take that back to their board and see whether that's okay with them.
My concern is this, that the reason we're not taking ownership is the liability question, but if the liability exists and previously unknown, then we've already paid for it. We are, in fact, assuming the liability in a financial sense.
You're not assuming the environmental liability, but you're correct. You would have paid, in a sense, you would have paid for the $10 a square foot for that part of the property.
I have one more question, so please give me a second round. I will have an amendment, it seems.
So I just want to say it's 12:35, and I know we have a whole other section that we wanted to get to, but I see 5 people in the queue, so I'm just giving you all notice that you might not have a whole lot of time at the end to do the kind of presentation that you want to do, so just consider that when we have a half hour left or whatever we have.
Yeah, so we would probably just reschedule.
Okay.
I think is probably where we're at, given where we
Yep,
are.
I think so.
Maybe we just assume we'll reschedule.
Okay, so sorry, but, all right, Betty.
Thank you. I have 3 questions, I think. First, for something this big, shouldn't there be a public hearing? Is there a requirement for public hearing?
There is not a requirement that the Urban Renewal Agency hold a public hearing on this. You certainly can decide that you want to do that before you approve, but legally you do not have to.
But we could do it.
It's up to you. You can have a public hearing on any matter you want.
Thank you.
Any matter the council wants.
Good clarification.
I have all kinds of ideas. When this is, I know that theoretically we are now the Urban Renewal Agency. When does this Urban Renewal District terminate? There's an
That's in
ending.
my memory now. I think it's 2024.
2024.
Yes.
That would be after we have finished all of this. Okay. And how much of the eWeb, I know that you said eWeb and the city are the same. It's not exact. We have a lot of this. They have a lot of the same customers as we have citizens, but it's not the same. How much of eWeb's base is outside the city, or people who are not part of the city?
I will throw out a number, and John, I'm looking at you to say I'm roughly correct. I would guess it's somewhere between 95 and 99% is an overlap.
If I may add, you have River Road, and you have Thurston, and you have all the way up to Bayou.
Okay, so probably 80 to 90% would be an overlap.
Thank you. That's something to consider, too. I'm not making comments, I'm just asking questions. Thank you. That's all.
Chris?
Thank you. And just a quick one, and it was something Mike mentioned that came up. Year 6, we paid $6. Actually, we only had to pay $3 million because we'd already sold $3 million. I'm pretty hypothetical. So we sold $3 million worth of the property. So at the end of year 5, we pay the remaining $3. So we pay out $3. Year 7, we sell another piece of property for $3 million. Do we have to split that, or do we reimburse the $6 first and then we go into the splitting scenario?
We reimburse until the amount that has been sold exceeds the guaranteed price.
Okay.
eWeb doesn't get a share of it.
Okay. So we make ourselves whole first. So if we go into year 7, 8, 9, 10, and we continue to manage and sell property, we make ourselves whole. So theoretically, we're not out anything then if we continue on with the deal. So we pay $6 million at the end of 5 years, worst case scenario, but we still get to continue on restoring that and making ourselves whole before we have to split any money.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
So I've got 3 people signed up for round 2, but before we get to that, I don't know if John's the best person to answer this or not, or you can, but I just want to clarify for the public, because I don't think they really understand the relationship between the city and eWeb and how we're separate and how we are interlocked. Maybe that's a Glenn question, but I think it's an important one.
I was hoping you were going to let John or Denny answer that question. So the way eWeb legally is a part of the city of Eugene. In a sense, and I don't think eWeb would agree with this description, but it's the closest I have to explain this to a layperson. eWeb, in a sense, is a department of the city, but it doesn't report to the city manager. It doesn't most of the time report to the city council. It has an independently elected board that governs it, but in certain cases it requires approval of of the city council, not the Urban Renewal Agency, for example, in issuing long-term bonds. So eWeb doesn't have that authority. The city council has that authority. So it's part of the city of Eugene, but it's governed by, in most cases, an independently elected board. It has exclusive authority in the area of utilities that it runs, and so it gets to make those decisions. The city council does not.
So probably this doesn't make it any easier for people, but I do want to say that even though we're separate and interlocked, in a sense, the overarching thing is that we all are a part of the city and work in the interest of the city. And that kind of leads up to this discussion of why we are separate, but we're working together on this particular project.
You said that so much better than I.
What?
You said that so much better than I did.
Oh, I don't know if I did or not, but I was really trying to it's a very confusing thing for the public. Okay, Alan.
Answer your question, Glenn. Yes, the agreement, in my mind, needs to include a rebate for environmentally acceptable land that was taken out past year 5. That seems consistent with the logic going all the way through there, and if we need to add that in, we should. And second, what's been our due diligence on the environmental issues? Is staff comfortable that the site is reasonably environmentally clean? I know you can't know that because you haven't dug up every square inch of it, but
I'll start, and then maybe Glenn can weigh in a little bit too.
our due diligence.
There's been a lot of work done. In fact, if you recall, we have a major brownfield program. We received EPA grant funds to start a brownfield program. We used some of that grant, or eWeb used some of that grant, to do pretty significant level 2 work, investigation, borings drilled all over the site. Based on that, there's really no major concerns sitting where we are today. And the remaining remediation I would characterize as pretty minimal and with not a high ticket attached to it. The real risk or issue is what happens when you start digging up. Is there something there that we don't know about? I'm pretty confident that that's, because a lot of work's been done over the years, there's no major issue, but there's always that risk.
The only thing I would add, and I agree with all that, is what gives me confidence is DEQ has been involved, and it was DEQ that told us that they expected, with some fairly minimal amount of remediation, that no further action letter could be issued. So in their mind, having reviewed the mountains of data, that's what they're concluding.
Section 6 refers to asbestos surveys of the surplus buildings. So what happens if asbestos is found in those buildings? That isn't addressed in Section 6.
I think that's a environmental remediation issue, yes.
Section 10, city will coordinate with eWeb staff and provide information. What's eWeb's role going to be in this next 5 years, for instance?
We'll need to continue to partner with them in some respects, especially during due diligence, because they have access to information. We need access to the site. We need to look at utilities. We need to look at a lot of things. So they'll be there as a partner to help us through whatever technical issues we have, but really, and we'll keep them informed. I think that's really our obligation. Is we'll give them updates and we'll make sure that they know what's going on. But really, they're really giving us sole discretion to take the lead and negotiate and decide how much and who we're going to sell the property to and how it gets redeveloped and so forth, so on and so forth. So I think that's how I would characterize the relationship with eWeb at this point. We're still a partner. We just bear the responsibility financially and to see the project being delivered.
Section 11 refers to relocation of utilities, and that the relocation of utilities shall be paid for by the requesting entity. Isn't that always going to be the city or the developer?
Generally, yes, I think that's correct.
Okay. Section 12 says nothing in this agreement shall prohibit eWeb from addressing operations and maintenance issues of existing structures in the property, but there's no requirement in here for them to do that and maintain those while this 5-year period is going on?
We're not accepting any responsibility for the maintenance of those structures. I think it's at their discretion as to what they need to do to maintain those buildings at this point.
But they still own it.
That's
Have
correct.
Responsibility for it.
Yep.
Okay. And then the last part of that, leasing arrangements of existing structures. Could they make a lease that goes beyond 5 years?
I think technically they could. Hopefully we would have some discussions about the benefits of those, and that's the partnering opportunity that I think needs to occur.
The detailed agreement will specify what they can or cannot do in terms of leasing. If there's an option for eWeb to be able to lease, it would be a fairly, at least in my mind, a fairly small window in which they could enter into a lease and for which properties, because our ability to get a developer interested would be significantly constrained if portions of this site were subject to, and I'm not even thinking it's what happens after 5 years, it's what happens within 5 years. And so this is something that as Williams and Dame is doing its due diligence, and we're working on the more detailed agreement, it's like, okay, so what really makes sense? If Williams and Dame says, boy, I'm all in, we want to do this, and no, we don't care about that particular section, we wouldn't get to that for at least 5 years, and eWeb says, boy, we'd like to lease that out for 5 years, why not? But if Williams and Dame says, boy, we're really interested, and it's essential that we be able to develop this parcel in year 1, and eWeb says we want to sign a 10-year lease for that parcel, then I think we'd say that doesn't really work.
Right, that would be my concern, because it would limit our ability to then sell the land or develop it, especially since there's a lot of existing structures there that could potentially do that. So I think we want to make sure that didn't happen. Final question. The deal where you have excess revenue after the amount that we agreed to, say $6 million, the first $1 million goes 75 UWeb, 25 city, then 50-50, then 25 UWeb, 75 city. What was the rationale for that, as opposed to just saying we'll split it, or the city gets all the proceeds?
I think, and John, you may have to jump in here, we talked about a couple different options. One would be 50-50, one would be 75-25, the way we did it. You can have any number of options. Because there's a disagreement as to, so how much is the value, the true value, in eWeb's view, it's closer to its appraisal. Yet the foundation had a different amount. So this was just an attempt to come up with something that had symmetry to it, which is why it's the 75-25, 50-50, 25-75.
What were the appraisals that eWeb and the foundation had for the property?
Both had ranges, but generally, the eWeb appraisal high was 9.1, the foundation 5.1. So again, the midpoint is where we started.
The foundation's high point was 5.1.
9.1 and, yes, and I'm sorry, I said 5.1. 5.71 was foundation, 9.1 was eWeb's appraisal.
Hey, George,
Thanks, Mayor. Okay, that's good. That was one of my questions. So there were only those two appraisals that were dealing with the U of O foundations and eWeb's on
As
appraisal?
part of this RFQ process since the master plan was adopted, I can't speak to historical appraisals that eWeb might have done in the past, but those are the recent ones relative to this
The
project.
two most recent, okay. And you told us how much those were for. Okay, thank you. Well, I would requested to see those appraisals. We're, going to, looks like we're going to instruct the manager to go ahead and enter negotiations. And as the Urban Renewal Board, we bear a tremendous fiducial responsibility to the taxpayers. And, you went on the lower end of you didn't just split it in half. That's good. And you offered, I had emailed asking to see the appraisals and also any environmental work that needed to be done, and you emailed me back and said, well, they're private. It's private information. And it just seems like to me, in the interest of transparent government, we should be able to see those appraisals before we vote on basically purchasing, call it what you will, purchasing property for $6 million. I just think we need to see that. And also, I have another question. One of the reasons that the U of O Foundation pulled out is because their engineers pointed out that it's really unknown what the substrate is like in a large part of the property. That a lot of it is built on fill, and that's true because all you have to do is go along the bike path and you will see it's riprap all the way down to the river. That is not the natural formation. That was all put in place by humans, and a large part of the property, the central property, is fill, and any developer is going to want to know how far down that goes. And the U of O Foundation's engineering firm suggested that 20 geoprobes and at least 10 or 15 core samples be taken to determine the nature of the substrate. Because if it's their estimation was it could be 15 feet deep down to the Eugene Formation, which is a solid rock foundation. So my question is this in the plans? I mean, is somebody planning to do that work, to hire an engineering company to find out what's under there? Because if I'm buying a piece of property, I want to know A, environmental, B, what's it like? Can I build a 5-story building without sinking 15 or more feet deep foundations? That's going to be very expensive and, add greatly to the cost of any development. So I'm just wondering if that's in the works.
Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of important points. One, the range of appraisals. This is a very complicated site, and it requires you to make a lot of assumptions about access to the site and buildability of the site and quiet zones and what's the market for proposed uses on the site. All of those things have dramatic impacts on how you might derive a value. So in a sense, it's not a surprise that there's a range of values because you have to do a lot of speculating. Regarding the buildability, I think we would always take a hard position that that's part of the due diligence that the builder needs to do themselves because they are ultimately going to build on the site, and we wouldn't want them to rely on any buildability on information that we gave them. So that's part of the due diligence process. So we have a 6-month due diligence period, and that is the purpose for that, so they can do their own investigation on the site.
So we're leaving it up to Williams and Dane to decide whether they want to do geoprobes to find out if the site's suitable to build on, and I don't know how much that costs. I'm not an engineer, but or a geologist, but it seems like that's going to be many thousands of dollars.
Mike, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. What did you say the appraisal of the admin building was these days?
I don't have that information.
You don't have that information at all?
I mean, not now. I mean, it's probably out there somewhere, but that's not something I know at this point. We'd have to do some research.
Are you aware of any appraisal that exists?
Not from memory. I'm assuming they have done appraisals in the past, but I don't recall any values that I could.
I don't know where I heard it, but I heard a $20 million number thrown around. Is that an unreasonable number?
I really don't know. I think you'd have to look at the square footage. I think sometimes it gets confused with what value is there for eWeb because they have a lot of infrastructure there, so the cost of moving that facility is significant because of all of the infrastructure. So, are you valuing it with all of that infrastructure there? Are you valuing it as an office building? I think I don't know the answer to that, but I don't know what the...
Hearing that number, I think somebody's been taking advantage of our new legalization laws, but that's just me. Okay, so...
Predated that.
Yeah, probably so. All right, so there have been a lot of conversational questions here about the city and the Urban Renewal Agency. So I'm going to ask, so there's absolute clarity here. This is an agreement between eWeb and the Urban Renewal Agency and not the city?
That is correct.
Okay, so it's not the city.
That is correct.
Okay. It's only the Urban Renewal Agency that's making this agreement, right? So, year 6, Urban Renewal Agency says to eWeb, thanks guys, we've paid you already, we'll take possession of the property, right? And then the agency dissolves in year 8, in 2024, when the district expires. Then what?
It's been a while since I've looked at the statutes on that, but there are provisions in the statute as to what happens with the assets of an agency when the agency terminates. Now, that's what happens when the agency terminates, not when a particular district terminates. So it could be that actually, even though the district terminates in 2024, that the property would remain, under your hypothetical, the property would continue to remain in the name of the Urban Renewal Agency, and this body would still get to decide what happens. If the Riverfront District terminated and the Downtown District terminated and there were no other urban renewal districts that you form sometime in the next 8 years, and this body, acting as the Urban Renewal Agency, decides it's time to terminate the agency, then I believe what the statutes say is the property would then transfer to, or the assets would transfer to the city unless some other arrangement was made. You could have a fire sale and say, we're going to sell it to somebody for $2.
As a corollary, we've made the agreement, we haven't taken possession of the property. The agency and the district go away after we've paid the money. But the property is still in the possession and ownership of eWeb. What happens then?
It would depend on what this body between now and then decides should happen then. I mean, it could be something that could be addressed in the agreement just by saying that the Urban Renewal Agency has the ability to assign its rights and obligations to another entity, in which case the agency could assign those to the city. And if you as the agency decides to assign it to yourself and you as the council agrees to accept it, then the assets would transfer, or the rights would transfer. But it's not something that we are dealing with, at least in the term sheet, because it's something that we could deal with, or this body could deal with, at any point between now and 2024.
So some future council could see a different decision, a different direction here, and make a different decision entirely.
That's always the case.
Right.
Well, that leads me to want to make an amendment, again, with regard to this, and I don't want to get it too messy as we get back towards eWeb with it and their board, because they've already approved this. This seems a little bit, that's not something we've thought through with regard to the previous negotiations with eWeb?
It's not something we have...
Nature of the future of the agency?
Right. It's not something we have discussed because Again, it's not a question as to whether the district goes away. It would be a question as to whether the agency, whether the City Council and the Urban Renewal Agency decide that it's time to stop being an urban renewal agency.
Does the Urban Renewal Agency exist with no districts
Yes.
as an entity?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
If I could just add, I think there are actually lots of agreements that we already have. Like, Urban Renewal Agency makes loans through its downtown revitalization loan programs. Those terms might extend beyond the life of the district, but there still those agreements are going to have to be dealt with at some point if that were to occur. So I think this wouldn't be unique in that regard. We have other agreements that are out there that may be in the same situation, and I assume we have a path to deal with all of those.
So the agency can exist and function long-term, long past the existence of any particular district or none at all?
Correct.
Thank you.
Alan, quick.
When you make the motion, Greg, I think Glenn has some additional language. But what will Williams and Dane do during this due diligence period? Those 6 months.
I mean, ultimately, what you're trying to get to is there enough value, is there enough upside to move forward with a redevelopment project? So that's complicated. You have to look at a lot of different issues. You have to assess the market, and they've done a lot of housing, for example. So if they want to do housing, they need to do a market analysis to see how does housing work in Eugene from a market standpoint. They need to look at environmental. They need to look at buildability. They need to look at all of those issues to decide whether they want to purchase some or all of the project and start redeveloping it. So I think in this case, it's pretty deep as far as how much due diligence they will probably want to do, because this is a complicated project and it's big. Maybe not big for them, but big for us. So I think that's really to find out if there's enough value and upside for them to take on this project, really is what they're trying to determine.
So it kind of brings into question whether or not the property is developable. Having the U of O Foundation pull out of it brings that into question. Wouldn't it be more prudent for us to wait until Williams and Dame have done their due diligence before we sign this memorandum of understanding and obligate us to buy the property in 5 years? And then we'd know whether or not they thought it was developable, since that is an open question.
I think, we've been working with them, talking with them for months. I think they are actually waiting for our agreement with eWeb to be penciled or penned before they move forward. So I think this would be an actual requirement for them to move forward, because if there is uncertainty about who they're negotiating with and who's in the lead, I think that just brings a lot of question to the table as to how to move forward. So I think this is a pretty critical path for them as well.
So we wouldn't know if it's developable based on Williams and Dame's opinion from their due diligence before we sign this. That risk is on us.
Correct.
Could be zero.
But it may not be Williams and Dame. They may spend a month and decide they're not the right team for this project. In that case, we'd move on and try to facilitate discussions with some other interested parties. That's really where we're headed.
As long as there's no fatal flaw on the property, and you don't see any fatal flaw on the property.
No, I mean, there's been a lot of work done thus far, and the foundation probably has a different risk profile than other developers. So I don't necessarily think it's an apples to apples conclusion. Just because one party doesn't move forward doesn't necessarily mean another won't move forward, especially if you don't intend to maybe even develop the whole property individually. You might want to bring in other developers, and foundation may have a different approach. Maybe they wanted to do the whole thing themselves. Another party might want to parcel it out to different investors in different aspects of the project. So I think I wouldn't necessarily jump to the conclusion if it doesn't work for one party, it's not going to work for the
Right. My opinion about the U of O Foundation was they were over their head and they threw up a bunch of red herrings when they left, but that's my opinion.
Well, and I don't know if that's accurate or not, but one of the main differences that I see between the foundation and Williams and Dame is the foundation is not a developer. They're not a real estate developer. They don't have significant experience in dealing with property that has some environmental contamination. Williams and Dame does, and they have dealt with property that has far more significant contamination than what anybody believes is at the eWeb site. And so for Williams and Dame, based on at least what we know so far, the site is attractive enough to say, yeah, we're interested in seeing if we can develop it. For the foundation, it's like, ooh, it's contaminated. There's a risk there, and we're not used to dealing with that kind of risk. And I've seen that with lots of, in my prior life, clients who were looking at developing contaminated properties. Some developers that have the experience know, oh yeah, we can work through all that. Developers who don't have that experience and are used to developing on clean sites get very nervous because they just don't have the experience.
That's what I meant by them being over their heads.
Chris, real quickly.
Yeah. So what we're making a motion for today is to go ahead and authorize you to execute an agreement based on the general points that are in today, knowing there's going to be more detail prepared. Will we have a chance to see the final detailed agreement once it's actually put together?
That wouldn't be our intent, and the reason why, normally what happens with these is the agreement will be 100% in compliance with what you approve. And I know there's an amendment that some bodies might offer. If that's an amendment, EWEB approves that, which it feels logical that they would, then we would just negotiate the agreement within those boundaries. So there wouldn't be anything else that council really needs to do because honestly it becomes sort of a wordsmithing exercise at that point.
Okay.
And so
and not for
our intent
approval.
would not be to bring that final back because you've given us the parameters on how that negotiation needs to look.
Yeah, and I'm not really asking to bring it back for some sort of additional approval or work session or whatever, but just out of curiosity to see what the final thing was, just
absolutely.
as a piece of
You'll be able
info.
to see the final agreement, no problem.
I think if we've approved these, then that's probably sufficient with whatever amendments we want to put in, which brings my second point. If there's amendments being proposed at this meeting, depending on what those amendments are, we can't really make an amendment that pins down what a future council can or cannot do with regard to this agreement?
You would authorize the city manager to enter into an agreement subject to these terms. And so we could then sign that agreement. The next urban renewal agency / city council, let's say next March, can say, we don't really like some of the terms of that agreement. We want them changed. The agreement's already been signed. We are bound by it as much as EWEB is bound by it. You could say, we would like to change some of those. We can go to EWEB and say, hey, we'd like to change some of these agreements. Are you okay with that? If they agree and you agree, then we can change them. But once the agreement is signed, it is legally binding on both parties, and nobody gets to make a unilateral change to it.
Okay, so once the agreement is signed, the elements within the agreement are binding even to a future council?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, on the table.
I move to authorize the agency director to execute an agreement with EWEB related to the negotiation, disposition, and redevelopment of the EWEB riverfront property, consistent with the outline of terms included in attachment A.
Moved and
Second, is there something you want to add to that, though, Glenn?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Do we have a queue?
Mike, you want to put something out here?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Mayor. I move to amend, and perhaps Glenn would
Can I give you
be...
the language?
Sure, that'd be fine. What language would you suggest?
To add a new section 13 that provides for a refund of a pro rata portion of the guaranteed payment in the event that a decision is made after year 5 that property will be retained by EWEB due to an environmental contamination concern.
So moved.
Is it a friendly?
I accept.
Done.
All right.
Just like that. May I ask one more question, please? Mr. Manager, do you imagine, based on your negotiations so far, that presents any negotiation difficulty with the EWEB board?
What I do think it presents is, as a couple of you mentioned, it does feel like there's a logical, it fits the same logic going into the 5 years as it would post 5 years. In any discussions I've had with Roger Gray, Roger has never believed or wanted EWEB to transfer liability to the city, environmental liability. He's been very clear all along that that's not their intent. Their intent is not all, but they don't want to be required to remediate a liability if it isn't financially makes sense for them. And I don't have any concerns about that. So this feels like it's in that same logic that he and I have had conversations, but he'll have to talk with his board about that.
Well, I was wanting to look around the room when I asked that, too, as a matter of fact. But, okay. Thank you, sir, very much.
I want to say the whole board's not here.
Yeah, right.
Betty.
I move that we have a public hearing before making a decision.
Moved. No second. Okay, back to the motion. Yes.
Yeah, I feel after grilling you guys on all these different things, I think you've done a good job of thinking this through. I think you answered all of my questions. The one part that I had pause about, which was, is this property really developable? I would not agree to this if Williams and Dame hadn't stepped up to the plate and decided they would go forward and do their due diligence to develop this. If nobody were standing in that place, I'd be very reluctant. That would bring up, in my mind, a big question as to whether or not it was developable in a reasonable time frame. But since they are very experienced and have a good track record of development of properties, that makes that risk become low to me. And with that and all the questions answered, and the way that you guys have thought this through, and the friendly amendment, I'm okay with this.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I want to say that I tend to agree with Betty about public input at this point before a move of this kind. I think it's important that the public be a part of having an opportunity to comment on what happens in that space. But for me, I'm willing to vote yes today because the master planning process was a very long public process about what will this look like and how and why and when. And I would say that what we're doing today isn't necessarily making decisions about the specifics that'll be done there so much as we're putting into action the public process that already took place to plan what would happen there. So I'm comfortable moving forward today.
Claire?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate Mike's comments about the public process to create the master plan. I think that's important to keep in mind. And in spite of some of the uncertainty involved, I do support the proposal for the reasons staff has outlined. It's already publicly owned land. It's a significant piece of land adjacent to our downtown, sitting right along the river. And the city has more experience in this kind of work than EWEB, so I think that can lead to a better development than might otherwise have happened. And I think we are more motivated than EWEB to make sure that the property is developed in a way that gives the greatest benefit to the city and our residents. Like Al, I am also relieved that the developer is still interested in working on this project. I think that bodes well for the success, given that the first developer got cold feet and in retrospect may not have really been the best choice for the project. And having a single developer can be a real advantage on such a large project, as it can ensure better overall consistency with the work and limit complications that can come with working with multiple developers for our city staff. So having the developer still involved is a big plus and important factor in my willingness to support this proposal. And my view is that taking on this project should be viewed both as an asset and a liability, just like owning our own airport is. You know, it provides a great benefit, but it also requires resources and attention. So, you know, I think we're crafting an agreement that is working to limit our liability as much as possible while putting us in the driver's seat for how this property is transformed into a benefit to our city in the form of taxable development, increased density, new parkland, and finally having access to the views of the river and Alton Baker Park that have only been enjoyed by EWEB staff really up till now. And we don't want this property sitting vacant for decades the way some industrial lands had been nearby. So I think even under the worst case scenario that we've been trying to ferret out in this conversation, and if we find it challenging to develop, having the Urban Renewal Agency in control gives us the ability to make our own decisions about the site rather than hoping that EWEB is going to take action to make it a usable space for the city. So all things considered, I think this is the best way forward for us.
I have Betty and then George Poling.
Thank you. I want to point out that the public was not involved in discussion of the city becoming the developer. That's a separate thing from the plan. And there were many people, including some in this room, who were very hesitant to have the city, were worried that the city might commit to developing the Civic Stadium site, which is a much smaller thing than this. Thank you.
George Bowling.
Thank you. Yeah, what we're looking at, and Danny alluded to this is a 100-year project that we're going, a project that's going to go for at least 100 years. And it's something that I believe that, whether you want to call it the city or the Urban Renewal Agency, needs to make a priority, which I believe we're making it pretty clear it is our priority. There's been a lot of work done by John and by Denny and all of our staff, by Roger Gray, the eWeb board and their staff, and it hasn't been easy, but I appreciate all the work that's been done. There's been talk about the foundation and the reasons why they did or did not go forward. You gotta give them credit. Their heart was in the right place, and I think that they realized that their priorities were elsewhere, and that was the reason why they decided. So, I'm not faulting them for the decisions that they made. In a way, I'm kind of glad that they did make that decision, because we are now getting interest being shown by people that have done these types of projects on these types of properties with the river, the parks, and everything else. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and I'm just hopeful that we can continue moving on this way and get this thing developed, and maybe not us, but our grandchildren and great-grandchildren can enjoy it in the future.
Chris.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, I agree with George. I think this is one of those legacy decisions, because I see this as an incredibly developable and highly attractive piece of land. I think the potential here is enormous, and the goal for all of us here, whether it's eWeb or the city, is to get this piece of land developed, to do something good here with what is essentially blank land. And I think the potential is great, and I think the city is the best party to be involved in managing that. If we gave it to a third party to do it, we would not have any control on what actually gets developed there. And we do have a master plan, and I think the city is the best agency to ensure that that master plan is followed as closely as possible. I think we also have the horsepower to do this job in a reasonable time, but not only operationally, which I have no doubt about, but I think also politically, which is also an important element. I think we have a council now that could actually help to make this happen as well, and I think we should take advantage of that unique merging of two important elements. A lot of South Manhattan Island is built on fill. Skyscrapers are built on fill. I know my dad was involved in some of those fill projects. So you can build incredible stuff on fill. You just have to know what you're doing. And I think the kind of developers that we could work with, not just Dane, but other developers, would look at this site and say, oh yeah, this is incredible. I see all sorts of enormous potential here. And I think with us involved, we can make that happen sooner rather than later. So I'm not thinking 10, 15 years from now. I'm thinking 5, 6, 7 years from now. We can get done what we really want to get done here. And I think it requires us to be involved to make that happen.
And I think besides all of the other things that have been mentioned, that this is, and I think it fits with the master plan, but for me, it's taking our council goals and what we want to have happen for our city and being able to use that master plan to meet some of those things. And the one thing I didn't hear mentioned today, which is really important to me, is housing. It's not only housing requirements that we need for our land use planning efforts, but it's really the lack of housing that we have and opportunities that we have for people in our area of all incomes. And so this is an opportunity to work on the workforce housing issue. This is an opportunity to work on many things that we care deeply about as a community. So I look at this as not only trying to get the best deal, but really trying to get the best deal for everyone. With that, all those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In opposition, 2. It passes. Thank you very much. Okay.
People can't do their presentation.